He was humiliated and forced to leave his first-class seat, but just minutes later, the flight attendant, the one who had embarrassed him, found herself in the middle of a series of unimaginable events. What happened on that flight not only changed his life forever, but also delivered a powerful and unforgettable lesson to the entire airline. Before we get started, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future videos. Among the bustling crowd at the international airport, one man stood out with his composed demeanor and the quiet confidence that radiated from his every gesture. His name was Ethan Reed, a successful businessman, striding toward the security checkpoint with a calmness that suggested everything in his life was in perfect order. Ethan was impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit. The crisp white cuffs of his shirt peeked out just enough to reveal an elegant, understated watch, a choice only someone with a truly refined sense of style would make. In his left hand, he carried a deep brown leather briefcase, and in his right hand, he firmly held a first-class boarding pass. This wasn't just another business trip for Ethan. It was the culmination of weeks of preparation and an important meeting where he would represent his company in finalizing a multi-million-dollar contract. As he entered the first-class cabin, Ethan's sharp yet approachable gaze swept across the seat numbers. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Some passengers watched him with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with a more critical eye. Ethan, however, was unfazed. Life had taught him an important lesson: the opinions of others, whether positive or negative, didn't define his worth. He soon located his seat, a spacious and private spot that offered the perfect environment for work. Before sitting down, Ethan gave a polite, subdued smile to the passenger across from him, a middle-aged woman who appeared to be quite wealthy. She nodded in acknowledgement, though her gaze lingered on Ethan with a faint expression of curiosity or perhaps judgment. Ethan noticed her reaction but chose not to dwell on it. With practiced precision, he placed his leather briefcase neatly into the overhead compartment, sat down, and pulled out his iPad. Unlocking it, he resumed reviewing an unfinished document. His fingers moved skillfully across the screen as he immersed himself in the work at hand. Around him, the faint sounds of the cabin, the footsteps of flight attendants, the rustling of passengers settling their luggage began to fade away. His focus was laser-sharp as he prepared for the critical meeting ahead, knowing full well that even the smallest detail could be the deciding factor in the deal's success. After a few minutes, Ethan became aware of a lingering gaze directed at him. Glancing up briefly, he noticed a flight attendant walking slowly down the aisle. Her name tag read Catherine Brooks. She was a white woman with neatly pinned dark brown hair, and her uniform fit her athletic frame with perfect precision. Catherine's expression was professional and composed, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin with a meticulousness that hinted at her dedication to her role. It was as though she was mentally noting every detail, ensuring the cabin met her high standards. As she passed Ethan's seat, Catherine's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. Her expression didn't show curiosity or friendliness. Instead, there was a clear sense of suspicion in her eyes. She paused for a moment, and then, in a deliberate and measured way, stepped closer to where he was seated. "Excuse me, sir," Catherine said, her tone polite but noticeably firm. "May I check your ticket, please?" Ethan looked up, slightly surprised, but he kept his composure. He gave a small nod, reached into the pocket of his suit jacket, and handed her the ticket. "Of course," he replied, his deep voice calm and steady. Catherine took the ticket, glanced at it briefly, and then checked something on the handheld device she carried. A faint frown crossed her face before she returned the ticket without saying anything more. Ethan slid the ticket back into his pocket, gave a small, polite smile, and returned his attention to his iPad. Catherine moved on down the aisle, but something about the man lingered in her mind. There was an unease she couldn't shake, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Was it his air of quiet confidence? The way he seemed completely at ease in first class, as though he had always belonged there? Or was it something else entirely? Catherine didn't know, but the feeling gnawed at her, pushing her to investigate further. A short while later, as Ethan worked intently on his iPad, he became aware of Catherine's presence again, now standing beside him. This time, her expression had shifted, no longer merely suspicious but cold and resolute. "Excuse me, but I don't believe this seat is appropriate for you," Catherine said, her tone losing the courtesy it carried earlier. "There may have been a mistake with your ticket." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. He tilted his head as if to ensure he had heard her correctly. This seat isn't appropriate? What exactly do you mean? We've just double-checked the details, Catherine said, cutting him off before he could say more. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to the economy section. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across Ethan's face, but it was quickly replaced by his usual composure. I booked a first-class ticket well in advance, and it was confirmed at check-in. There's no mistake here, he said, his voice firm yet calm, as though stating an indisputable fact. But Catherine didn't back down. If you do not comply, I'll have no choice but to call security to handle the situation, she stated, her tone final, leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan took a deep breath, a flicker of irritation passing through his eyes before he regained control of his emotions. After a moment of silence, he nodded. Very well, I'll move. He carefully packed his belongings, slipping the iPad into his briefcase, and stood up. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath, and the eyes of the other passengers turned toward him, some filled with sympathy, others awkwardly avoiding his gaze. A few stared with thinly veiled curiosity. Ethan walked slowly behind Catherine toward the back of the plane, where a cramped and far less comfortable seat in economy awaited him. As he sat down, the hum of the plane's engines felt louder and more oppressive. The curious stares from those in the economy section, ranging from sympathetic to puzzled, only added to the tension of the moment. Ethan said nothing. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out his phone, scrolled to a familiar contact, and made a call. The call was answered almost immediately after the first ring. I'm having an issue here, Ethan said firmly. I need assistance. Stand by for further instructions. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin seemed to slow down. The faint murmurs of nearby passengers continued to ripple through the air, but for Ethan Reed, all external sounds faded into the background. He leaned back against the cramped seat in the economy class section, his gaze drifting absent-mindedly through the small window, where layers of white clouds stretched across the deep blue sky. His phone was already tucked away in his jacket pocket, but his thoughts continued to race. Ethan was not the kind of man to accept injustice, and it was clear that this situation had crossed a line. The economy class seat was even tighter than he had expected, with so little legroom that his knees nearly touched the seat in front of him. The relentless roar of the plane's engines filled the air, forcing him to shift in his seat in search of some semblance of comfort. Yet Ethan showed no sign of frustration. On the contrary, his calm demeanor, reflected in his steady gaze, made the entire situation feel even more enigmatic. Nearby, a middle-aged woman with silvery hair turned toward Ethan, her expression filled with sympathy. Did they force you to sit back here? She asked softly, her tone tinged with indignation. Ethan glanced at her and offered a faint smile. Sometimes you have to let others believe they have the right to make decisions, he replied in a measured voice, one that carried both calmness and a subtle edge of sharpness. The woman frowned slightly, as though trying to decipher his words, but she didn't press further. Instead, she sighed and muttered something about how people these days just don't know what fairness is before turning back toward her own seat. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, flight attendant Catherine Brooks carried on with her duties, exuding an air of total confidence. To her, the earlier incident had been handled swiftly and efficiently. She reassured herself that her actions were the right ones. This was protocol, Catherine thought to herself. She had always prided herself on adhering strictly to rules, and in her mind, allowing Ethan Reed to remain in first class didn't feel right. It was an anomaly she had corrected. And yet, a lingering unease had begun to creep into Catherine's thoughts. Ethan's eyes, his unsettlingly calm, composed gaze as he left his seat, kept replaying in her mind. She tried to brush it off, but every time she recalled that look, a chill ran down her spine. There was something about him that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite put it into words. You really moved him out of first class. A voice behind Catherine broke through her thoughts. It was Anna, a younger flight attendant with kind eyes and a warm, approachable demeanor. Anna had just finished serving drinks in the economy section and was now standing near the flight attendant's rest area. Catherine shrugged, turning to face Anna. I did. Something about him felt off. He didn't seem like the kind of person who belongs in first class, she said, her tone self-assured, though her eyes shifted slightly, betraying her unease. Anna frowned, concern clearly written on her face. But he had a valid ticket, didn't he? Why did you have to move him? It was just a gut feeling, Catherine replied. We need to keep everything safe and follow proper protocol. Anna hesitated for a moment before letting out a sigh. I don't know, Catherine. I just hope this doesn't come back to haunt you. He doesn't seem like the kind of person who will let this slide. Catherine furrowed her brow but didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, attempting to focus on the other passengers. Yet Anna's words lingered in her mind, echoing with an uncomfortable truth. Maybe, just maybe, she had misjudged the situation. At the back of the plane, Ethan was focused on his iPad screen, but this time he wasn't working. Instead, he was typing notes into a document app, meticulously recounting every detail of the incident. Catherine's tone, the way she looked at him, the rigid professionalism in her voice, and even her threat to call security, he captured it all with precise clarity. 5 minutes later, Ethan pulled out his phone and typed a short message to David Clark, his best friend and personal attorney. The text was brief: there's been an incident. Start preparing. David's reply came almost instantly: understood. Waiting for your signal. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, slipped his phone back into his pocket, and leaned back in his seat. With his usual patience and calm demeanor, he knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. Meanwhile, Catherine stepped into the flight attendant's rest area, where the airline's internal phone system was located. She hadn't expected that the next call she received would completely shatter the confidence she'd been clinging to since the beginning of the flight. The phone rang. Catherine picked it up and held the receiver to her ear. "This is Flight Attendant Catherine Brooks," she said, her voice steady. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "Hello, Miss Brooks. This is Linda Hall from the airline's customer care office. We've just received a direct complaint regarding you." Catherine froze. A complaint? From who? Linda responded without hesitation: a first-class passenger. He reported that you moved him out of his seat without valid justification, despite his ticket being fully compliant. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. I was just following protocol," she stammered, her hand gripping the receiver tightly. Linda's tone remained unwavering. "Ms. Brooks, we require you to provide a detailed report of this incident as soon as the plane lands. Additionally, I strongly advise you to exercise caution in your actions and words for the remainder of this flight." The call ended, leaving Catherine frozen in the crew's rest area. She swallowed hard, her palms slick with sweat. A wave of unease rose within her, a growing realization that this situation was spiraling out of her control. In the back of the plane, Ethan sat near the rear window, gazing outside with a detached but inscrutable expression. The passengers around him seemed to pick up on something different about his presence. A man seated nearby, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, turned to Ethan and spoke in a quiet tone. "You okay? Looked like they gave you a hard time back there." Ethan turned toward him, offering a polite smile. "I'm fine. Sometimes you have to let things play out naturally before taking the right action." The man frowned slightly, as if trying to grasp the meaning behind Ethan's words, but ultimately nodded and said nothing further. A chime sounded over the intercom, followed by a message from the cockpit announcing that the plane had reached its cruising altitude and passengers could begin to relax. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved his phone, and sent a quick message to David: "Everything is unfolding as expected. Be ready to move." In the first-class cabin, Catherine couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on her. The chill of Ethan's calm and piercing gaze earlier still lingered in her mind, replaying over and over. And each time she passed through the economy section on her way to check on passengers, she caught sight of him sitting there, composed and unbothered, as if nothing had happened. It unsettled her even more. Back in the crew's rest area, Catherine overheard Anna speaking in hushed tones to another colleague. I don't know what she was thinking, but this could end up being a huge problem for her. He doesn't seem like the kind of person she should have crossed. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who Ethan was, but it was becoming painfully clear to her that she had gravely misjudged him. Inside the airplane cabin, the atmosphere seemed to have calmed, but an undercurrent of tension quietly lingered, as if everything was building toward an inevitable turning point. Ethan Reed remained seated in economy class, his posture calm and steady, yet every movement and glance radiated an unusual energy. To those who didn't know him, he might simply appear as a passenger unfairly treated. But to those who paid closer attention, it was clear that he was more than just a victim. Once the plane had reached cruising altitude, Ethan pulled out his phone and sent a short but powerful message: "Activate the plan." On the other end of the line was David Clark, Ethan's closest friend and personal attorney. David, one of the best lawyers in the country, read the message without needing any further clarification. He understood immediately that when Ethan sent a message like this, it meant the situation had gone too far, and it was time to take action. David wasn't just a friend but also one of Ethan's most trusted partners throughout his career. He knew Ethan better than most, calm, analytical, and never impulsive. But when Ethan chose to respond to a situation, he always did so with careful planning and precise execution. This time, David knew Ethan had likely foreseen and prepared for this moment well in advance. In his high-rise office in downtown New York City, David placed his phone on the desk and swiftly opened his laptop. He began drafting emails to the airline's senior executives, directly addressing the incident unfolding on the flight. His tone was sharp and professional, devoid of emotional language, but the content carried an unmistakable weight. The message made it clear that this would not end with a routine complaint. David emphasized that the airline should prepare for significant consequences. Meanwhile, Ethan remained seated on the plane, unhurried and calm. He carefully folded his iPad, slid it back into his leather briefcase, and sat upright. He didn't need to do anything else, everything was already set in motion. All he had to do was wait, and he knew that the results he wanted would naturally unfold. In the first-class cabin, Catherine Brooks felt the pressure mounting. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage challenging situations, but this time it felt as though things were slipping beyond her control. No matter how much she tried to project confidence, the growing sense of unease within her was becoming harder to suppress. As she walked through the economy section once more to check on passengers, her gaze instinctively fell on Ethan. He sat there, quiet and composed, without a trace of anger or frustration, but it was precisely his calmness that unsettled Catherine the most. His quiet demeanor wasn't passive, it felt like a silent reminder, a reflection of her mistake, and it left her feeling exposed. When Catherine returned to the flight attendant's rest area, she overheard Anna speaking softly to another colleague. Although Anna was trying to keep her voice down, her concern was evident in every word. "I don't understand why Catherine did that. She just moved a man who looked like a businessman out of his first-class seat. But I don't think he's an ordinary person," Anna said, her voice laced with unease. "The way he looked at me when I was serving drinks, it felt like he knows more than he lets on." "Who do you think he is?" her colleague asked, clearly intrigued. Anna hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. "Maybe someone influential? Could be a major shareholder or someone important in the airline industry. I don't know, but I'm sure moving him was a big mistake." Catherine overheard every word, and her heart began to race. She tried to reassure herself that everything was still under control, but deep down, a part of her knew she had misjudged the man. He wasn't just another passenger, and the look in his eyes had made it clear this wouldn't end easily. The sharp ring of the phone in the flight attendant's rest area pierced the heavy atmosphere, startling Catherine so much she nearly dropped the tray of drinks she was holding. Quickly setting the tray down, she hurried over to answer the call. "This is Flight Attendant Catherine Brooks," she said, her voice attempting to sound composed. On the other end was a deep, authoritative voice belonging to a middle-aged woman. "Hello, Miss Brooks. This is Linda Hall from the airline's customer care office. We've just received direct feedback from a passenger on your flight one who was moved from first class to economy." Catherine straightened up, doing her best to maintain her composure. "Yes, that incident did occur. But I believe I acted in accordance with procedure." There was a brief pause, as if Linda wanted to ensure Catherine fully understood the gravity of what she was about to say. "Ms. Brooks, that passenger is Ethan Reed. In case you're unaware, he's one of the airline's largest shareholders. His complaint has been escalated directly to the executive board." Catherine's face went pale, and it felt as though the world was crumbling around her. "A major shareholder," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct," Linda confirmed, her tone steady and unwavering. "The executive board has requested that you provide a full, detailed report on this incident as soon as the flight lands. Additionally, they've instructed you to refrain from taking any further actions that could worsen the situation." The call ended, leaving Catherine standing there with trembling hands. She returned to her workstation, but her mind was blank, replaying Linda's words over and over. She couldn't stop thinking about how colossal her mistake had been. A major shareholder. She should have known from the moment she met his gaze, that confident, authoritative look, but she had ignored it. Meanwhile, Ethan remained seated quietly by the window, his expression calm as he gazed outside. He had heard the phone ring in the flight attendant's rest area and knew that the chain of events he had set in motion was now underway. There was no need for him to confront anyone directly. His team was already taking care of it for him. A middle-aged man seated next to Ethan, who had been watching him curiously, finally spoke up. "You seem awfully calm. I'm guessing this isn't your first time dealing with something like this." Ethan turned to the man with a polite smile. "Sometimes the most important thing isn't how you react, it's how you allow others to recognize their mistakes." The man chuckled. "That's wise. I don't think I'd be able to stay as calm as you if I were in your position." Ethan didn't reply, simply offering another small smile before turning back to look out the window. He knew the wheels were already in motion, and now Catherine would have to face consequences she never anticipated. As the plane glided smoothly through layers of white clouds, the quiet inside the cabin began to carry an invisible weight of tension. Passengers stayed absorbed in their activities, some reading books, others relaxing or watching movies. But in the flight attendant's rest area, the atmosphere was entirely different. Catherine Brooks felt as though everything around her was tightening, like an invisible noose drawing closer with each passing moment. Catherine sat on the edge of a chair, her hands clenched tightly together, her gaze fixed on the wall in front of her. Linda Hall from customer care had been unmistakably clear. Ethan Reed, the man she had unilaterally moved from first class to economy, wasn't just any passenger. He was one of the airline's largest shareholders. A wave of panic rose within her like a tidal surge. A major shareholder? How could I not have known that? Catherine's mind raced. Over the years, she had served countless VIP passengers, but never had anyone made her feel so exposed through sheer silence. Ethan didn't yell. He didn't complain. Instead, it was his unnerving calmness that left her feeling as though he was watching her unravel, letting her mistakes speak for themselves. Anna, one of Catherine's colleagues, approached her with a worried expression. "Are you okay? You don't look so good." Catherine tried to put on a brave face, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. "I'm fine, just a little stressed, that's all." Anna studied her carefully, her concern deepening. "Catherine, I think you need to prepare yourself. He's not just some ordinary passenger. Can't you feel it? The way he sits, the way he speaks, everything about him carries this power." Catherine didn't respond. She knew Anna was right, but admitting it felt like giving up the last shred of control she had. Instead, she tried to convince herself that everything would smooth over once they landed. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. As Catherine struggled to steady herself, the phone in the rest area rang. To anyone else, it might have been an ordinary sound, but to Catherine, it felt like a warning bell. She stood up, her legs slightly unsteady, and walked over to pick up the receiver. "This is Flight Attendant Catherine Brooks," she said, forcing her voice to sound calm. On the other end of the line was a deep, authoritative voice. "Ms. Brooks, this is Richard Hale, CEO of the airline. I believe you've already been informed by customer care about the incident involving passenger Ethan Reed." Catherine froze, her body stiffening as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The CEO was calling her directly? This was far from routine. "Yes, Mr. Hale," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard continued, his tone steady and devoid of emotion. "Are you aware that Mr. Reed is not just an ordinary first-class passenger, but one of our airline's largest strategic investors?" I didn't know, Sir," Catherine replied, her voice wavering. "Let me make it clear," Richard said, his tone sharpening. "Your actions removing one of our key shareholders from his first-class seat without valid justification not only disrupted his experience but also risked damaging the reputation of the airline. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Catherine tried to explain. "Sir, I just thought. He didn't seem to belong in first class. I suspected there might have been some kind of mistake with his ticket. I was only trying to ensure safety." Richard cut her off, his voice turning cold. "Safety? Are you referring to a distinguished businessman with a valid ticket, quietly working on his iPad? Are you referring to a shareholder who has invested millions of dollars into our airline? If this is how you treat our shareholders, I shudder to imagine how you treat regular passengers." Catherine felt her throat tighten. She couldn't find any further words to defend herself. "Here are my instructions," Richard continued firmly. "When the plane lands, you will remain on board to provide a detailed report of this incident. Additionally, you are being placed on temporary suspension pending an internal investigation. And a word of advice: if you have any intention of justifying your actions, I suggest you think very carefully before you speak. The call ended. Catherine placed the phone back on its cradle, her hands trembling so much she nearly dropped the receiver. In the economy cabin, Ethan remained unfazed as Catherine walked past, her face pale and her expression visibly shaken. He didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, he stayed leaned back in his seat, hands folded across his stomach, his eyes gazing out the window in a relaxed manner. He knew he didn't need to do anything further. Everything he had set in motion was already taking care of itself. A few passengers nearby began whispering to each other. A man seated directly behind Ethan leaned forward slightly and whispered, "You seem awfully calm. What's going on with that flight attendant? She looks really stressed out." Ethan turned slightly, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Sometimes, the most important lessons have to be learned the hard way," he replied calmly. The man didn't ask any more questions. Ethan's response was enough to suggest that something significant was happening, though the full scope of it was beyond the man's understanding. As the flight continued, the airline's leadership team had already begun moving into crisis management mode. Karen Mitchell, a member of the board of directors, received an email from David Clark, Ethan Reed's attorney. The email was sharp yet impeccably polite, outlining in detail the discriminatory treatment Ethan had endured and emphasizing that this was not just a personal incident, but a clear indication of the need for systemic reform in the airline's employee training practices. Karen sat in her office, staring at the screen. "Ethan Reed," she muttered under her breath. "This man doesn't let anything slide, does he?" She picked up the phone and called Richard Hale. "Richard, we need to arrange an emergency meeting as soon as this flight lands, and I want a face-to-face meeting with Ethan Reed. We're not just going to apologize, we need to take immediate action." Richard sighed audibly on the other end of the line. "I've already instructed Catherine Brooks to prepare a full report as soon as the plane touches down. But Karen, I'm afraid Ethan Reed won't be satisfied with just an apology." Karen paused, deep in thought. "We need to go further than that. If we don't take decisive action, this incident could shake shareholder confidence and seriously damage the airline's reputation. Ethan Reed is a smart man, he won't simply let this go." Richard agreed. "I'll start preparing everything we need. We can't allow this incident to become a stain on the airline's history." The plane began its descent, and passengers were instructed to fasten their seatbelts in preparation for landing. Outside the window, the sky shifted to a pale gray as the ground below came into clearer view. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained quiet, but for some, particularly Catherine Brooks and Ethan Reed, it felt as though everything was hurtling toward an unavoidable turning point. Catherine sat motionless in the flight attendant's rest area, her palms damp with sweat as she desperately tried to think of a way out of her current predicament. "I made a huge mistake." That was the only thought that echoed through her mind. But her mistake was no longer just about moving a passenger. It had now escalated into an incident with the potential to ignite a full-blown crisis for the entire airline. Ethan remained seated in economy class, calmly fastening his seatbelt as instructed. Every movement he made was composed and natural, as if he were entirely unaffected by what had just occurred. Yet, in his sharp gaze, there was an intensity that suggested he wasn't merely waiting for the plane to land, he was waiting to act. A few rows away, an older passenger was quietly discussing the situation with his wife. "Do you think that was discrimination?" the woman whispered, her eyes glancing toward Ethan. "Without a doubt," the man replied in a low but firm tone. "A man like him clearly didn't end up in the wrong seat by accident. That flight attendant simply didn't think he belonged in first class, and that's just plain wrong." Though their whispers were quiet, the sentiment began to spread among nearby passengers. Several eyes turned toward Ethan, some filled with curiosity, others with empathy. But Ethan didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to justify himself to anyone. Justice would arrive in its own time on the terms he had already set in motion. As soon as the plane touched down, Catherine felt her chest tighten as though it were being squeezed by an invisible force. She knew this wasn't the end of it, this was only the beginning. From the corner of the rest area, she watched as Ethan stood, calmly retrieving his leather briefcase from the overhead bin. His expression remained composed, but there was an undeniable air of authority radiating from him that left Catherine frozen in place, as if she were paralyzed by his presence. The passengers disembarked one by one. Ethan waited until nearly the very end, neither rushing nor impatient, as if savoring the calm before stepping into the battle that awaited him. As he approached the aircraft door, where Catherine stood with the other flight attendants bidding farewell to passengers, his gaze briefly swept over her. He said nothing, made no gesture, just a single look. But it was enough to make Catherine feel as though he had seen right through her. Ethan gave a polite nod to the crew and then walked out of the plane. In the VIP lounge of the airport, the airline's senior management team had gathered to meet Ethan. Richard Hale, the CEO, and Karen Mitchell, a member of the board of directors, were seated at a large conference table, their expressions betraying clear anxiety. When Ethan entered, both of them immediately stood, eager to show the utmost respect. "Mr. Reed," Richard began, doing his best to keep his voice steady, "we deeply apologize for the unfortunate incident you experienced on your flight. Please know that we are conducting a thorough investigation and are committed to ensuring this never happens again." Ethan took a seat across from them, placing his leather briefcase on the table with deliberate care. He didn't respond right away. Instead, his piercing gaze lingered on both of them for a few seconds, as though assessing their sincerity. "Mr. Hale, M.S. Mitchell," Ethan began, his voice calm yet firm, "what I expect here is not merely an apology. I expect a genuine commitment from this airline, not just to me, but to every passenger, regardless of their skin color, social class, or status. The room fell silent. Karen nodded slowly, jotting down Ethan's words word for word. "We understand, Mr. Reed," she said, "and I assure you we will implement the necessary measures to improve our service culture." Ethan leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. "I need to see a concrete plan. I'm not interested in hollow promises. I want a clear timeline, a detailed schedule of the changes you plan to implement, and regular progress reports. If I don't see real action, I will have to consider legal action or even reevaluating my investment." His final words made Richard and Karen go pale. Both understood that Ethan wasn't just speaking about personal vindication, he was speaking about the airline's survival. Meanwhile, Catherine was in a separate meeting room at the airport, where she was required to present her report on the incident. Across from her sat three mid-level executives tasked with investigating the situation. In front of her on the table was a stack of paperwork and incident reports submitted by the customer care office. Catherine, one of the executives, began, his tone firm. "Please explain clearly why you moved passenger Ethan Reed from first class to economy, even though his ticket was fully valid." Catherine hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of her chair tightly. I felt that he didn't seem to belong in first class. I suspected there might have been an error in his booking." "And on what basis did you feel he didn't belong?" the executive interrupted, his voice laced with skepticism. "Did you observe any behavior that violated rules, or do you have any evidence to suggest he was in the wrong seat?" Catherine couldn't answer. She knew full well that her judgment had been entirely based on her personal feelings. A bias she now realized was rooted in unconscious prejudice. Another executive flipped through a page of the report in front of him. "M.S. Brooks, let me make this clear. The passenger you moved wasn't just a distinguished businessman with a valid ticket, he's also one of this airline's largest strategic investors. Your mistake isn't just a personal error, it's a serious issue that impacts our company's reputation." Catherine felt a chill wash over her entire body. She had no defense left. Her mistake was glaringly obvious now, and she knew the consequences were looming closer than ever. When the meeting with Ethan concluded, Richard Hale stepped out of the room, his expression weary but determined. Walking beside him was Karen Mitchell. "We need to implement immediate changes," Richard said. "This isn't just about appeasing Ethan Reed, it's about making sure this never happens again. Starting next week, I want unconscious bias training rolled out for all employees." Karen nodded in agreement. "I also think we need to revisit and overhaul our complaint handling processes. Ethan isn't the only one who's likely endured situations like this, and if we don't improve, I'm certain there will be more incidents." Richard sighed deeply. "We were lucky Ethan Reed is a calm man, but I worry that not everyone will handle this kind of situation as gracefully as he did." As the plane landed, Catherine Brooks felt the heavy weight of pressure pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that this wasn't over yet, and the real storm was just beginning. Her actions during the flight weren't merely a personal mistake, they had now become part of a much larger issue, one that affected the airline system, reputation, and, most of all, her own career. Ethan Reed walked calmly down the jet bridge into the VIP section of the airport, his leather briefcase held firmly in one hand. There was no rush, no urgency. His calm demeanor and quiet confidence made him stand out to anyone watching. Ethan knew everything was proceeding exactly as planned. What needed to be done was no longer in his hands. It had been entrusted to the professional team he relied on. In the VIP lounge, an airline employee escorted Ethan to a private meeting room, where Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, and Karen Mitchell, a member of the board of directors, were waiting. The atmosphere in the room was uncomfortably tense. Both Richard and Karen tried to appear composed, but the worry in their eyes was unmistakable as they watched Ethan enter. "Mr. Reed," Richard began, doing his best to keep his tone steady, "we sincerely apologize for the unfortunate incident you experienced on your flight. Please know that we are addressing this matter with the utmost seriousness." Ethan set his leather briefcase on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. For a few seconds, he silently observed the two executives sitting across from him, letting the tension in the room stretch. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet firm, carrying a weight that made every word land with precision. "Mr. Hale, M.S. Mitchell," Ethan began, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "I didn't come here to hear empty apologies. I expect your airline to not only address this mistake as it pertains to me, but to ensure that actions like this never happen to any other passenger again. This incident isn't just a personal failure, it's a systemic failure." Richard Hale took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "We understand, Mr. Reed, and I assure you we are taking action. I've already directed our HR team to draft a comprehensive training program to eliminate bias in our processes. We're also reviewing our complaint handling policies to ensure that no one is treated unfairly." Ethan didn't break eye contact. "I need to see a concrete plan," he said. "Not just promises or surface-level commitments. I need a clear timeline, measurable goals, and independent oversight to ensure that you actually follow through on what you're saying." Karen Mitchell nodded, immediately jotting notes into her notebook. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Reed. We will provide you with a detailed report outlining the steps the airline will take within the next 7 days, and we welcome any input you may have during the process." Ethan gave a faint smile, one that expressed neither satisfaction nor anger. "I hope so, because if not, I won't just take this matter to court, I'll take it to the public. This airline's reputation won't survive another scandal." Ethan's words cut through the room like a sharp blade, leaving an unmistakable chill in the air. Richard and Karen realized they weren't simply dealing with a dissatisfied customer, they were up against a man with both the power and the resources to shake the very foundation of their airline. Meanwhile, in another meeting room at the airport, Catherine Brooks sat across from a panel of HR and training executives. The harsh white lights above illuminated the stark expression on her pale face. Mark Greaves, the head of HR, flipped through a report in his hands. "Catherine," he began, his tone firm, "we need you to clearly explain your decision to move passenger Ethan Reed to economy class. He had a valid first-class ticket. Your actions were a serious violation of the airline service policy." Catherine tried to maintain her composure, but her voice trembled as she spoke. I thought he didn't seem to belong in first class. I suspected there might have been an error with his booking, and I just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly." Mark furrowed his brow, his gaze cold and piercing. "You suspected? And what, exactly, made you believe he didn't belong?" Catherine couldn't answer. She knew full well that her actions had been based purely on instinct, a subconscious feeling she now recognized as bias. "M.S. Brooks," Mark continued, "passenger Ethan Reed wasn't just a businessman with a valid ticket. He's also one of the airline's largest shareholders. Your actions didn't just harm him personally, they've placed the entire airline in a precarious position. We cannot and will not tolerate bias or discrimination of any kind." Catherine lowered her head. She had no defense left to offer. A week after the incident, the airline issued an official announcement suspending Catherine pending the results of an internal investigation. The news spread quickly among her colleagues, making Catherine the focus of hushed conversations and speculation. But Catherine no longer cared about the stares or the whispers. She had spent the past week reflecting on her mistakes. She began reading about unconscious bias, trying to understand how seemingly small prejudices could lead to poor decisions and cause deep harm. One day, Catherine sat down at her computer and composed an email to Ethan Reed. "Mr. Reed, I am writing this email to offer you my sincerest apology. My actions on the flight were inexcusable, and I have come to realize they stemmed from an unconscious bias that I was previously unaware of. I want you to know that it was never my intention to cause you harm, but I understand that this does not excuse my mistake. I am working to learn and grow from this experience, and I hope you can accept my apology. Sincerely. Me, Catherine Brooks. Catherine pressed send, feeling as though she had lifted a part of the weight that had been pressing down on her. When Ethan received Catherine's email, he read it line by line with his usual calm demeanor. He wasn't someone who forgave easily, but neither was he someone who held on to grudges. He understood that the greatest mistake a person could make wasn't the act of failing, but the refusal to learn from that failure. Ethan replied with a brief but meaningful message. MS. Brooks. Thank you for writing this email. Mistakes are inevitable in life, but what matters most is recognizing them and working to make things right. I hope you will continue to learn and grow, not just in your work but in how you treat others. Best regards, Ethan Reed. In the months that followed, the airline implemented significant changes, including mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees and an overhaul of the passenger complaint handling process. These efforts were not only well received internally but also garnered positive attention from the public. Ethan continued to receive regular progress updates, and he was pleased to see that his words had led to tangible change. The storm had passed, but its aftermath had sparked meaningful reforms, a major step forward for fairness and transparency. 3 months after the incident, everything had changed significantly, not just for the airline but for everyone involved. The event on that flight had become a major lesson, sparking sweeping changes in how the airline operated and served its customers. But in the midst of this transformation, the personal stories of Ethan Reed, Catherine Brooks, and the airline's leadership continued to unfold. Since being suspended, Catherine Brooks had spent her time reflecting deeply on what had happened. She was no longer the confident, self-assured person she had once been. Instead, she was a woman facing herself, searching for answers to the biggest question: where did I go wrong? She enrolled in an intensive unconscious bias training program at a nonprofit organization focused on social equity. There, she was exposed to real stories from people who had faced discrimination, stories that she had never previously considered. These lessons not only shifted her perspective but also helped her understand the profound negative impact that even small biases could have. One day, during a workshop, the instructor posed a question to the class. Have you ever made a decision based on a feeling without verifying it? And could that decision have hurt someone? Catherine felt the question hit her like a dagger to the heart. She remembered Ethan Reed's calm yet piercing gaze on that flight, how it seemed as though he knew exactly what she had been thinking. After completing the program, Catherine decided to write a personal essay about the incident she had experienced, titled "When Bias Takes the Lead, a Lesson from the Skies." In it, she not only recounted her mistake but also analyzed how unconscious bias had driven her to make the wrong decision. She submitted the essay to the nonprofit organization, hoping her story could serve as a cautionary tale for others. While Catherine was on her journey of self-reflection and growth, Ethan Reed continued his role overseeing the airline's progress. He received regular updates from David Clark, his best friend and attorney, ensuring that the commitments the airline had made were not just empty promises. One day in his office, David handed Ethan a detailed report. "This is their progress," David said. "They've completed 60% of the unconscious bias training program. The feedback from participating employees has been pretty positive. They've also revamped their complaint handling process now. Every complaint is addressed within 48 hours, and there's a dedicated team overseeing it." Ethan skimmed through the report, his eyes pausing on a note from Karen Mitchell, a board member. "We've come to recognize that the incident with Mr. Ethan Reed has been a major catalyst for improving our customer service culture. This is a lesson we will never forget." Ethan gave a small smile. "They're moving in the right direction," he said to David, "but we need to make sure they stay on track. I don't want to see these reforms fade away in a few years." One morning, Ethan received an unexpected call from Karen Mitchell. Her voice over the phone was both formal and sincere. "Mr. Reed, I know you're busy, but would you consider attending a workshop we're hosting? It's the first in our comprehensive training program on equity and combating bias. Your presence would send a powerful message to the entire team." Ethan paused for a moment before replying. "I'll come. But not to criticize or monitor. I'm coming to witness the change." That day, Ethan walked into the airline's large conference room, where over 200 employees were attending the workshop. He wasn't dressed in his usual sharp suit, but instead opted for a simple outfit, a white button-down shirt and dark slacks. Yet, his presence immediately commanded attention. To everyone in the room, he represented change, a living example that justice could be pursued calmly and firmly. During the workshop, Ethan didn't give a long speech. He simply stood up and spoke briefly. We are all human, and as humans, we make mistakes. But what matters most is that we learn from those mistakes. I'm glad to see this airline moving forward, and I hope that what we do here today lays the foundation for a more equitable future. The room was silent for a moment before a wave of applause filled the space. After the workshop, as Ethan prepared to leave, someone approached him. It was Catherine Brooks. She was no longer wearing her flight attendant uniform, instead dressed in a simple, light blue dress. Her face carried a mix of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Reed," she began in a low voice, "I'm not sure if you remember me, but I'm Catherine Brooks, the person who moved your seat on that flight." Ethan paused, his calm gaze meeting hers. "I remember you, Catherine," he said, his tone neither angry nor distant. "Thank you," she continued, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you for helping me see my mistakes. Thank you for not making things worse and instead helping me and this airline learn and grow. I was wrong, and I'm working hard to make it right." Ethan nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Catherine, I'm not perfect either, and I've made my share of mistakes in life. What matters most is recognizing those mistakes and working to change. That's what I value most." They shook hands, and in that brief moment, all the tension between them seemed to dissolve. As time passed, the airline gradually became a role model in the industry, recognized for its culture of equity and outstanding customer service. The changes Ethan had demanded not only improved the passenger experience but also boosted employee morale and engagement. As for Ethan, he continued his work investing, building, and supporting systems that fostered positive change. The incident on that flight was not just a personal experience but a lasting reminder that significant change often starts with small actions. Catherine, after spending time making amends, was eventually reinstated at the airline but in a new role. She became a trainer, leading workshops on unconscious bias and customer service skills. From someone who had once made a grave mistake, she transformed into someone helping others avoid similar missteps. Up in the skies, planes continued to take off and land, carrying with them countless stories, journeys, and important lessons. But in the hearts of those who lived through that incident, one thing remained clear: change is never easy, but it is always worth it. Today's story is not just about a flight incident, it's a powerful reminder that every action, no matter how small, carries consequences. From one wrong decision to a systemic transformation, this journey illustrates that fairness and respect are not just necessities, they are responsibilities we all share. What do you think about the lessons from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button, share this story to spread its meaningful message, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. See you in the next video.